Tyler Tringas, welcome to the show.
Hey Brian, good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. We were actually just hanging out in person, like a couple weeks ago over at Founders Summit, which you guys put on. It's a great
Yeah,
time.
just a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's great to finally have you on the show. We've known each other for a couple of years now, but I wanted to really dive into your work with ComFund, which Zip Message, of course, is funded by ComFund, and it's been a really
hmm
great experience for the past over a year now. I've been in
Yeah,
there.
glad to hear it.
So yeah, it's been really awesome, and I don't want to like go through the whole backstory. I know you've told that on other podcasts. I always like to point people to Mixergy as like the canonical like story of everybody's startup over there.
Yeah.
Um, but I did want to like sort of because I think there are some interesting parts of the story of like first how you got into Confund, which
Mm.
it's sort of like it just sort of like came out of nowhere a few years ago when you
hmm
started it up. But I'm also more interested in because it's been several years now, what you've learned over the years of and how it's grown and how it's evolved and maybe what has changed over this time. Um,
Sure.
so I mean, for those who are sort of just hearing about this for the first time, I mean, how do you explain what's like the explainer for ComFund right now?
Yeah. So we're the Calm Company Fund. We are like many early stage investors. We're a fund. We write checks. We give entrepreneurs capital to kind of build their business, and then we try to also help them succeed through a variety of mentorship, community resources, kind of the whole kit and caboodle. And the thing that makes us, I think, somewhat unique is that we're focused on a different category of entrepreneur than what most people would be familiar with, which would be like a traditional VC, right? Which is making early stage bets and hoping that you build kind of a multi-billion-dollar unicorn. And if you don't hit that, they'd rather you sort of hit that goal or die trying along the way. And we believe there's a sort of much wider spectrum of outcomes that entrepreneurs consider to be success. And we've structured our fund in such a way that those kinds of successes are also a success for us. So, if you just raise a small round of capital, you build a nice profitable business, maybe you sell it, maybe you run it for a long time and take profits out of it. All those kinds of scenarios are a win for our model, which is somewhat unusual in the market.
Yeah, it is unusual. And I remember, about a year ago when I was going through the process of
hmm
exploring multiple funding routes, I was sort of comparing just self funding like I've been for the last 10 plus years.
Yeah.
I was talking to several individual angel investors, maybe,
hmm
gathering up several checks from multiple people.
Yeah.
I was looking at a couple of different funds and it the model and the structure of the investment agreement through Comfund, it was both like unique, but to me it was the most attractive. Obviously, that's
Mm.
that's the direction I went.
Yeah.
Um, it sort of offered the most optionality, and it sort of
hmm
aligned with my personal goals and most likely scenarios of going forward. So like, how do you sort of explain it? I mean, I want to point folks to the Confund. It's confund.com, right? The website.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
everything, you guys have a lot of really good content and documentation on how the structure works. But
hmm
how do you sort of like explain to folks in a nutshell what makes it a little bit different from a typical, whether it's a fund or taking checks from angel investors? Like, yeah, how does Confund sort of fit in there?
Yeah, there's basically two pillars to it that you need to know. The first one is just what I pretty much just said, which is that, like our strategy and our vision for what kind of entrepreneurs we want to fund is just different from traditional venture funds. It's also different from, I would say, the substantial majority of angels, simply because a lot of angel investors have kind of adopted this mindset of being like a mini VC, right? They're sort of taking the strategies and tactics that they read about VCs using and applying it to their own angel investing. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. It's just that, they end up largely on average doing kind of the same sort of thing, which is, writing checks in the hopes that you build a truly massive business or you basically fail and lose all the money. So, we're trying to look for more of a, singles, doubles, and triples kind of approach to our portfolio versus the, tons of strikeouts and one home run kind of approach. Yeah, the second piece is you hit the nail on the head with the word optionality.
That's to me what sort of clicked in my mind, because like I was sort of going through this like crash course, of just the idea of taking investment and all the different options out there. And it took me a while to sort of like wrap my head and really understand what is the right fit for me. And it did come down to that idea that like, chances are I'm probably going to hold and go, slow and steady with this thing.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going to happen in the future, whether we would raise a venture round. I would say probably not. More likely is I would hold it for several, hopefully multiple years and get to some sort of exit sometime down the road. And I don't know when or what that would look like. And it seemed like the agreement for a comm fund and the numbers and everything just sort of like made sense. The other thing that you mentioned is that the network of all of the investors and all the mentors and fellow other founders in comm fund also made it pretty attractive. You sort of get the same benefit of being connected to individual investors, but through this network, and there's just a lot more of them. So so that was pretty cool too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real Calm Fund at the end of the day is very much a sort of scratch your own itch project where I'm trying to sort of build the support network and infrastructure and resources that I would have wanted to have had at the early start of my kind of entrepreneurial journey. You probably are very familiar with it, having been bootstrapping for a long time. It's kind of lonely. It's really hard to get like a lot of the mentorship and resources that you do get from working with accelerators and venture funds and stuff like that. You really do kind of miss out on that. And it can really accelerate your journey to have that support network and help you kind of see around corners, not reinvent the wheel, all that sort of stuff. And you can, and I think you've done a very good job of like kind of cobbling it together, right, through Twitter and through podcasts and through things like that. But there's something about layering in a financial incentive for everybody that just helps kind of bind it all together and keep everyone motivated. So yeah, I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've said this to other people before that like the network and the mentors and just like access to the whole community and all that. Like I wouldn't have joined ComFund just for that. Like still the decision for me to take funding was like a financial decision. And I liked it because it was like one check instead of gathering multiple checks and the complexity of all that. So so that was like sort of and then the deal terms and all that and the structure of the agreement all sort of like made sense to me. But then adding in the network and the connections, because I have built a personal network sort of outside of ComFund with a lot of other people over the years. But yeah, it sort of just all clicked together. And then I mean, you also add in like the resources and the tools and discounts and things like that. It's nice.
Yeah.
And we'll talk in the other episode about Founder Summit, which was great to start to meet even more people who are involved in this community as well. So I did want to go back a little bit to your story. For folks, like, can you give us like a nutshell of like your previous startup? And it just seemed like interesting to me to see someone like you go from bootstrapping a software SaaS, selling it, and then just deciding you're going to start a fund. It sort of just comes out of nowhere. Like that is not a typical path that we see folks like us. That sort of shift is really interesting to me.
Yeah, I think that it is interesting. So a couple of thoughts that come to mind about that transition. So yeah, I mean, first, as you mentioned, I had I've been an entrepreneur for a while, had some projects that didn't work, some projects that did work, eventually bootstrapped a B2B SaaS business, ran it, as basically a calm company, built it to a small remote team, nicely profitable business, and sold it to a private equity shop. At this point, almost 5 years ago now, time is really flying. But and so looking back on that, it was like, okay, I was really frustrated that I had no kind of financial partner to work with. And I had experienced that really, really acutely actually with a previous startup in the clean tech space, where it was my first startup ever. I was working as like a clean tech advisory person and basically in finance, and I wanted to build a software company in the clean tech space. And this is maybe like 2011. And I thought, okay, I was pretty naive. I was like, we genuinely did need some money. It wasn't really bootstrappable business. We needed like $1 million to build this thing. And we were like, okay, well, it's software, so I guess we should go pitch VCs. And we started talking to these VCs, and we started laying out this plan for like, we're going to raise $1 million, and then we're going to build like $100 million business, and this was our game plan. And we didn't know at the time that like pretty much excludes you, right? They were, we got like an interview at YC, and they were like, okay, but explain to me how this is worth $10 billion someday. And I was like, oh, it's definitely not. Like the market's way too small for us to build a $10 billion business. And so I kind of learned that lesson the hard way, that there's this whole network of financial institutions that fund entrepreneurs, but there's also a ton of white space where there's all these great entrepreneurs and great ideas that don't have any natural partner. So that was kind of frustrating for me after having bootstrapped the business. And so I started thinking about that problem. And at the same time, I heard I think it's Kevin Kelly was talking about that there's like this tiny little upper tip of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs pyramid, right? And so, you've got like meaningful work that people will pay you for and all that kind of stuff, and you're going up and up and up. And the very tip top, he says, it's something that maybe only you can do, right? That's like the most meaningful work you can possibly do. If you can find something that it's very arrogant to say like literally only I could do this, but sometimes you find something where the answer to that question is like maybe I'm like the only person who can really do this. And I was thinking through what I wanted to do next, and I had this background in finance. Like early on in my career, I was I was basically in an advisory role, but I was working with venture funds and pension funds and, massive companies like GE and Exxon and Fortune 100 companies and things like that. And I really had a pretty good understanding of how that world works. And then I took this complete hard pivot, like quit my job, learned to code, started to become a software entrepreneur. And so as I was thinking about, okay, why isn't there sort of like, our original pitch for the fund was funding for bootstrappers. It's like, why doesn't this exist? It's like, well, maybe it's actually just that there's almost nobody who takes a hard pivot out of the world of finance directly into bootstrapping SaaS businesses. And maybe there's just not someone with those two skill sets that they can sort of combine and build a fund for bootstrappers. So that was kind of the hunch that I had. I was like, well, maybe this opportunity is there because nobody else can really do it. And so we just started working on it, and it turns out this world is very unique and weird in the sense that you don't really need any licenses or certifications or anything to start what is it. We're effectively a venture fund in terms of regulatory purposes. And you just can do it. Like if you can convince enough people to work with you on it, you can just start it, which is kind of awesome and very kind of bootstrapper friendly. So
it's pretty interesting. It definitely makes a little bit more sense to me now, like seeing that. It's almost like your pivot into bootstrapped SaaS was like the unexpected turn in your career, and like to me it's like starting a fund like this, like coming out, because like when I think the big attraction to bootstrapping software businesses, like for me, I started to discover this whole ecosystem probably around like 2009, 2010, 2011, discovering Mixergy, discovering like Startups for the Rest of Us, and like all these different like communities. And what was most interesting to me was like how simple and straightforward it is. Like build a thing, sell it to customers.
Yeah.
Provide value. Make a nice, comfortable living, flexible, and do some work that you love, right? That's always been the most interesting and least complex thing. And I don't come from a background in finance. I've never been interested in this whole, in like the like structuring deals and things like that. And I've built and sold several businesses, and like the worst experiences of my career have been like dealing through that stuff, due diligence and like deal terms and all that stuff.
Yep.
So like just the simplicity of like building and going has been attractive. And
there's definitely days where I miss that simplicity. That's for sure.
Yeah. I mean, that's why
Yeah.
it's so interesting for me to see like someone who seems like it's like one of us, like one of these builders who you are, but then you sort of like have that background in finance. So makes total sense. Yeah, like getting into like the launch, like what year was it that you actually decided? So when you sold the business and then started Com Company Fund, which
So
I
there
know
was
at
a
the
couple.
time was Earnest Capital. But,
Yeah, there was a couple years actually in between, almost 2 years, I think. So I think I sold the business in 2017, and it wasn't until 2019 that we launched Earnest Capital, which was it's the same exact company for people who don't know. We just rebranded to Calm Company Fund.
yeah,
Yeah,
what
we
were you
launched
doing
it.
in that 2 years? Were you like exploring stuff, taking time off? What did that look like?
Yeah, I was. Yeah, I set this goal for myself of I sold the company. It wasn't like never work again money, but it was like you don't need to think about making money for a little while money. And so I thought, okay, well, what's something that I could do with my time that I can only do uh, because I don't need to think about money, right? That was like the filter that I was using for trying to figure out what to do with my time. I was like, this will be an interesting experiment. What stuff can I do that will be fun and that maybe I can only do because I don't need a salary or whatever for the foreseeable future? And it took a little winding path, but basically I ended up sort of joining this startup called Maptia, which was like a modern redo of National Geographic. So it was kind of like long form, beautiful photography forward journalism with the same kind of topics, conservation, anthropology, that sort of stuff. And I found this sort of, website and found the founders and convinced them to let me join them. We ended up basically it's kind of hard to even explain what happened, but we ended up launching an ocean conservation nonprofit called Sea Legacy. So we ended up collaborating with one of the most popular photographers on the site, and they kind of came to us and said, hey, we have a bunch of Instagram followers. We want to launch our own nonprofit so that we can do these ocean conservation expeditions and give away all of the assets and media to activist campaigns, right? And so we're like, okay, cool. And so we basically ended up taking this team that was working on this startup to go and help them launch this nonprofit. And we brought this sort of like SaaS mindset to it. So we built this like subscription membership product for people to make recurring donations. And it was kind of cool. Like you were a recurring member and you would get all this like behind the scenes content from the expeditions and all their photography tips and stuff like that. And but it was very like SaaS, focused, like with the funnels and all this kind of stuff. And pretty quickly it became like a real operation. It went from this little side hustle to like several $1 million a year run rate in a matter of months. And so I ended up getting sort of conscripted to go and be the COO of this nonprofit for about a year, which was fun. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot, but I learned that, the nonprofit world is not for me. So along the side, I was working on this fund idea, and yeah, kind of right at the same time that I was thinking about wrapping up that little tour. The first couple investors basically committed to the fund, so we were off to the races.
So I wanted to get into, I want to sort of like skip ahead, right? So you sort of cobbled together a couple early investors. I have like basically two more questions about Com Company Fund, and one was you guys went through a pretty interesting rebrand. You were originally called Earnest Capital, which I actually thought was a pretty cool name, and then now you're Com Company Fund. Can you talk a little bit about that? First of all, like why the change, and I'm actually more interested in like the process of changing the company name and like how difficult is that?
Yeah. So the reason for changing was twofold. The first one is I also liked Earnest Capital. I thought it was,
I mean, Com makes a lot of sense too.
Yeah.
Right? I like the branding of like it's totally what it's all about. So
Yes, exactly. So with Earnest Capital, I mean the brand I think worked pretty well out of the gates. Folks liked it. They kind of like got the vibe of it. The big problem we had from a branding perspective that was really bugging me for the first year and a half that we existed was we kept getting defined as like not VC, right? We'd get defined as like VC alternatives. People would put us in blog posts of like 16 alternatives to VC, like what's going on in the alt VC space. Let's talk to Tyler at Earnest Capital. And I think from a branding perspective, it's really bad to be defined as a negative. Right, you want your brand to stand for something, not to stand for what you're not. And I actually saw this like firsthand from working in clean tech, which used to be called alternative energy until some very smart people said this sucks. Let's actually take an adjective that people like, which is clean, and let's sort of rally around clean energy, not alternative energy. And so we kind of had that same mindset.
Yeah, I haven't thought about that. That's an interesting take.
Yeah, exactly. And it was really it was just massively defining who we were, to the extent that it was also like getting confusing because, people would treat like what we were doing and I don't know, like Stripe Capital, and revenue-based financing and all these things, we'd be in all the same bucket. And it's like, these are very different products. So we need to do some work here to sort of, make it clear what we do and what we stand for.
It's almost like the previous name was like, sort of like defining the fund, whereas the new name Com Company Fund sort of defines the companies that you invest in, which almost tells half the story, at least half the story right there for a newcomer, whether it's an investor or a startup, right?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. We wanted something that, so once we kind of started the process of, okay, we're going to rebrand to something, we need something that we stand for. We wanted something that, entrepreneurs or companies would identify with, even if they weren't affiliated with the fund. That was the goal, right? So nobody was ever going to say like, oh, my company's an Earnest company, right? Like that means you're in our portfolio, right? That's it. But this idea of Calm Company is something that a lot of entrepreneurs aspire to, and we didn't really come up with it ourselves. We kind of, we already had this pretty sizable community from our portfolio and Twitter and wherever. We kind of just kept polling with different questions to sort of say like, what actually resonates with you, because we want to just attract more people like you. And calm was by far the adjective that stood out the most. So yeah, that was it was the clear choice when it finally came down to making that decision was, Calm Company Fund. There were a million other things that we tried, and there was no close second, basically.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm there's been some talk with some of the people that I get advice from and stuff about Zip Message. As we're sort of in the middle of this sort of, I don't know if I'd call it a pivot, but we're starting to focus in and start to niche down on coaches.
Yep.
And multiple people have suggested like, well, maybe you might start thinking about a rebrand of Zip Message. And, to be honest, like I'm not necessarily married to the name of Zip Message. And I could see how it doesn't fully paint the picture of where the product is headed. But at the same time, the idea of changing the name and the process of changing the name and the fallout from changing a name sort of scares me. And that's why I lean towards like, just don't change it.
Yeah.
And so like, I'm curious to hear like how I'm sure it's different, because Com Company Fund is not like just a single SaaS product. Like, has there been any challenge around like, now you introduce it as Com Company Fund, and maybe like in the early days of the new name, did you have to like constantly go through like, we're Com Company Fund, you might have heard us known as Earnest Capital before, but now we're this name, and like I fear that like having to explain the old name and the new name for like a year plus.
Yeah. So I'll say I did say that the reasons for the rebrand were twofold. One is the one that I just articulated to you, and the other one is that we got a cease and desist letter. Yeah, there. So this is a big problem with branding stuff in the what's just called financial institutions category of IP, which is there's so many firms out there. Every little LLC for buying up some bit of real estate has got a name, and they're frequently trademarked. And it turned out that some like retirement advisor in Georgia had trademarked the word earnest for the entire financial services industry. And
Oh, wow.
we were sort of like confused by that because there's a ton of things like that have the word earnest in it, including like earnest.com is like a student loan kind of site and stuff like that. Turns out like they were just suing everybody.
Oh, wow.
So that took it from a, maybe we should do this to, oh yeah, we have to do this. So to your point, like it's not something to take lightly. And if you don't have that kind of, external pressure, I do think it's okay to sort of wait. In terms of how the transition went, I think it actually went very well. Probably because I think honestly, and I can say this because I did about 1% of the work. What happened is basically Najva Sol, who's our head of marketing and an amazing branding agency called Scout Lab, they did 99% of the work, and they just nailed it, both with the name and with the branding and everything. It was like, when you get it right, it just fits, and everybody goes, oh yeah, of course. Like, of course, that's what you're called now, So we didn't have that much of an uphill battle in terms of that. There was, some ongoing, like, hey, people are like, what happened to your other company? It's like, oh, it's still the same company. We just rebranded, blah, blah, blah. But on the whole, it was not that much work after we launched it, to be honest. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I remember about a year ago, maybe a little bit before then, I forgot exactly when the rebrand happened, but like, I think it to me is like sort of an outsider looking in. It was like a more of an issue over a year ago, and now like anybody that I come across like sort of basically knows it as Com Company Fund,
Yeah.
Which is, I guess that's the goal, right?
Yeah. If you're going to rebrand, do it well. That's
yeah,
that's the lesson.
Yeah, awesome. I did want to ask about like things that you've learned or maybe tweaked or iterated on from your perspective in terms of like being successful with Com Company Fund, right? Like, so I know you're heavily involved in like the decision-making process on like funding startups and also, bringing investors in, but like, what are some of the things that like maybe you've like iterated on in terms of like the types of companies that you invest in or the criteria that you look for or just things that make the whole thing run more smoothly?
Yeah, good question. So one of the things I think that I've learned as a, people might not be familiar with the inner workings of how funds work. Some funds, they have a real sort of decision by committee. Maybe you have 3 partners and they all have to give a thumbs up before you make an investment. Sometimes you might have a literal investment committee who's a separate group of people that have to approve investments. That's kind of more of a thing for really, really big funds. But in my case, it's just me. Like I basically, I decide if I'm going to invest, and then we pull the trigger. There's no kind of other step for that. And that's kind of a lot of responsibility. And so very early on, one of the things that I was very reticent to do was kind of coloring outside the lines of the thesis that we laid down. We kind of gave this very detailed strategy for how we were going to invest. And part of it, for example, was like, we're only going to do very early stage stuff because, once a company is doing, let's say, close to $1 million a year in revenue, well, they have all these other options. They have debt financing. They could work with VCs. They blah, 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 blah. We don't want to go and compete with all those folks. So we're going to really, really stay in our lane. And I missed out on a couple of opportunities that would have been great had I had sort of the, I don't know, confidence or whatever to stray just a little bit outside of that lane that we'd created for ourselves. So that's something that, I think that's kind of a natural progression for investors, is to get a little more confidence of when to break your own rules. But that's something that, I had to learn the hard way by missing out on some really good investments for sure.
I mean, that makes sense, right? Because like I'm friends with a whole bunch of other SaaS founders, and a lot of them are like much further along in terms of like multiple years into their business.
Yeah.
But they are very much on the bootstrapper Com Company track, right? But they're just multiple years into it. And, maybe they're making some big investments in the business. They're starting to, invest in growth, but they don't necessarily want to go the VC route. There is still that like gap in the market, in that like middle ground. So like you're not in like idea stage first year, you're several years in, you're past product market fit, but you just want to sustain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's something we've learned, is just that there's, the opportunity is larger. I think it's a little bit like I don't know exactly how to say this without. So I think we overestimated the competition in terms of the competition being like other sources of funding, as saying like, well, the white space can't possibly be this huge. There can't be this many opportunities that people are just completely missing, and it turns out there really are. So we have a lot of work to do, basically. But
yeah, how about like just the dealing with the volume of? I mean, you must get pitched all the time. And I know you have like an official application process and all that. So like, how do you, any tips on how you have, not necessarily tips, but like things that you've optimized whether it's your time and the decision-making progress to make sure that you are getting exposure to the best possible opportunities. How do you sort of like sift through it all?
Yeah. It's a good question. It's the thing that we have maybe the least dialed down, despite making, I would say, huge progress on it. It's a really difficult challenge because, I don't control the volume of inbound, right? So we can set up a system that does a great job of managing when we get 200 applications a month, but then if a tweet goes viral or some publication decides to feature us or whatever, and we get 700 applications in a month, how do we prepare for that, right? What do we do? Like, time is still finite, so do I just give, shorter shrift to each application and try to make decisions faster? Do we just let our wait time triple, and start to fall over to the next month? It's actually very hard, and I've actually been trying to pull some insights from, like, industrial design, because there's certain types of manufacturing that have to deal with this sort of thing, where you have to build systems that are resilient to significant influxes of capacity. But the gist is it's extremely hard, and I'm actually still don't feel very happy with where we are. The main thing we've done is try to bring a lot more systemization to our approach. I think that in general, most people doing early stage investing, be they angels or VCs or whatever, the process is still very sort of like too artisanal and handcrafted, right? There's a lot of like, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to listen to your pitch for an hour, we're going to meet in a coffee shop, I'm going to look you in the eye, I'm going to decide, does this person have the right stuff, right? And I just think like we can do better and we can be more efficient about it. So now we do have like this really rigorous application process. We push everybody to it. It's open. We don't need a warm intro or any of that sort of stuff. And we also have a pretty detailed external research process that we do ourselves. So we get a lot of information from the founder, and then we go and we check on the competition, we check on the pricing landscape, we do all that sort of stuff, and we pull all that together into a research brief before I even meet with the founder. And that's been the main unlock for my time, has been to have actually tons of work done before I even get on a call with the founder, because I think that like my KPI is I want as many of the calls that if I'm going to spend an hour on a Zoom call with a founder, I want 100% of those ideally to convert to term sheets, right? I want 100% of those to be great companies that I'm excited to invest in. And so we've been trying to sort of close that gap and get to where, I think we're at probably around a third right now, which is, insane for the industry. The typical like angel or VC might meet with like 300 companies before they invest in one, right?
Yeah. It makes a ton of sense. I mean, and I could totally see how like just, like the whole idea of like a pitch deck can be it's just like a job, like a resume. Like, it's just going to be like the highlight reel, and half of it is kind of made up, and like, and you can't, and that's like not enough to go spend a half an hour on a call when you've got hundreds of these things coming, I mean, it sort of like reminds me, and it's just like any sales process, really. Like my previous company, Audience Ops, I went through great pains to make sure that like, because I didn't really enjoy doing sales calls. So if I was going to get on a call with someone, I wanted to know like they were basically sold, and it was just sort of crossing the T's and talking to them. Like I showed the pricing, I showed them like a 10-minute video, like everything before they even ever book a call with me. So that would just kind of show up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, same idea.
A lot of sense.
Yeah.